read from the first story in the collection, and that is the title story, Irregular Verbs. A piluar, to let a fire burn out. Gelas, to treat something with care. Pikana, to cut oneself with a fishhook. It is a well-known fact that there are no people more gifted at language than those of the Salutayan Isles. Salutayans live in small villages on 1,000 densely populated islands. Isolated but never alone, their languages change constantly, and new ones are born all the time. A Salutayan's family has a language unintelligible to their neighbors. His old friends, a jargon impenetrable to anyone outside their circle. Two Salutayans, sharing shelter from the rain, will, by the time it lets up, have developed a new dialect, with its own vocabulary and grammar, with tenses such as when the ground is dry enough to walk on, and before I was entirely wet. It was in just such circumstances that Sendiri Ong had met his wife Kasepi, and in such circumstances that he lost her. An afternoon spent in a palm tree shadow is enough time for two people to fall in love. A few moments enough to die when at sea. 18 monsoons had passed in between, enough time for the two of them to develop a language of such depth and complexity that no third person could ever learn it. So utterly their own that it was itself an island, without ties to any of its neighbors. For the 10 days of his mourning, Sendiri had stayed on the private floor of his house, listening to the fading echoes of his wife's voice. On the 11th day, he descended to the public floor. That was the longest time thought to be safe. Any more away from the great conversation, the hour in the evening in which all Salutayans join in maintaining their one common language, ran the risk of leaving a person stranded, isolated by changes in dialect. His friend Taman was waiting for him, feeding new coals for the brazier to replace those that had burned cold. It was just like Taman, Sendiri thought, to think of a little thing like that. And for a moment the sight of his old friend cheered him a little. Apa kabar, Taman said. Sendiri just stared, at first not recognizing the words in Grand Salutayan. How should I be, he asked after a moment. I'm here and she's not. As soon as he spoke, he regretted it, gave thanks that it was in Taman's nature to chew his words thoroughly before spitting them out. That's true, Taman said mildly. Wincing, Sendiri sat on the reed mat next to his friend. I'm sorry, he said. Thank you for coming here and for the coals. I've gotten very tired of cold rice. Taman smiled, clearly relieved at Sendiri's change of mood. It's hard, I know, coming back down, rejoining the rest of the world. Sendiri shook his head. 10 days to mourn someone who just isn't enough. A lifetime isn't enough, Taman said, smiling sadly. But it's all we have. That night, Sendiri realized he had forgotten a word. He had been dozing, half asleep, the smell of the squid curing in the thatch above, reminding him of his and Kasepi's last fishing trip together, when suddenly he could not remember the word for that moment at the end of a long season before the goatfish run, when you think you will die if you have another pint of dried fish. He couldn't remember which of them had coined it, one of 100,000 words they shared, but he knew that it was gone. That's ridiculous, he thought. It's just nibbling the line. He ran through syllables in his mind, trying to catch a memory that slipped and dodged around him, but it was no use. The hook was empty. He shook briefly, reaching out instinctively across the hammock for the warmth that had once reassured him. Sendiri cast his mind back, remembering conversations they had had, testing the memory like a tongue probing a loose tooth. Mana Adla Jarain. What was that word? Suddenly gaps were appearing in his memories. Where there was a Grand Salutayan equivalent, the word from that language slipped in. Things for which that language had no words were simply gone. Most frustrating, some were words he knew he had remembered that morning. So far, only 1 in 100 perhaps was gone, but more were joining them. He had never really thought of a language disappearing before. When his mother had died, he and his father preserved their family language, and when his father had died, other people, relatives and neighbors, had known enough of it to keep it alive in his mind. Giuseppe's family, though, had been from another village, not witness to their life together, and they had no children to carry their language on. When it faded from his mind, it would be as if it had never been, as if she had never been. Sendiri sat up, watched the holes in the thatch with the first hint of dawn, cursing the darkness. He would need light for what he had to do, and every moment that passed was his enemy. Salutaeans, on the whole, are not much for writing things down. Their languages are too fluid and mercurial to be caught on paper. Only Grand Salutaean has a written form, introduced by missionaries of the Southerner to spread his words to the Isles, and used by village headmen and island chiefs to record debts and proclamations. Sendiri, whose father had been a headman, knew how to read and write, and like most islanders, knew how to dry and prepare squid ink to sell to foreigners. Though his and Giuseppe's language was as alike to Grand Salutaean as a stingray is to a monkey, he bent his letters to his purposes, torturing and teasing the characters until they could record the sounds that would never be spoken again. He began opening the bundles of cold rice which friends and relatives had left as morning gifts to write on their banana leaf wrapping. Frantically he wrote word after word, pausing only to mix more ink when the bowl was dry. After some hours the house shook, but he did not look up from his work. Only when he heard the ladder up to the private floor creaking did he pause, put down the straightened fishhook he'd been using as a quill. "Sendiri?" Taman's voice called from halfway up. Friends though they were, the private floor was inviolate without an invitation. "What is it?" Sendiri asked. "The conversation," Taman said. Sendiri exhaled sharply, set his work aside. Had it been that long already? The great conversation was held an hour before dusk. He had not even noticed the shadows creeping across the floor. "Just a moment," he said, his joints complaining as he stood. He heard Taman climbing back down the ladder, waited until he felt the house sway as his friend's feet hit the floor before heading down himself. Taman waited until he had reached the floor, then the two wordlessly passed along the way to the broad walkway that joined his house to the rest of the village. Below, the receding tide had exposed the mud into which the village's posts were sunk, and the afternoon sun had left it stinking. Everywhere nets were hanging to dry, their sharp, salty smell burning Sendiri's nose. At the public walkway, all the villages were stretched out in the line that made up the great conversation. All voices were speaking in Grand Salutaean, in most cases, the only time they would speak it that day. Taman's uncle Paman, the headman, moved up and down the line, making small talk and ensuring everyone used the correct form, without words or constructions from other dialects creeping in. All Salutaeans know that their gift for languages could easily be a curse. Without a common tongue, the separate islands of their speech would drift inexorably apart. Sendiri joined in the conversation gamely, the words tasting flat and oily in his mouth. What, after all, could Grand Salutaean express? Village business, fishing advice, weather talk. Taman had returned to his assigned place in the line, so Sendiri made small talk with his neighbors, two nattering old women, Kiri on one side and Kanan on the other, meaningless prattle of rotting walkway boards and late fish runs. Finally, the sunlight reddened, the walkway fell into shadow, and he could go home. The conversation was over.